The last major piece of program flow that we're going to take a look at in this section are functions. Functions are a nice mechanism for breaking up large sections of code into smaller pieces that are reusable and make your programs easier to understand and maintain. And one of the things that you'll find when you're doing your C# development or development in any language really, you'll find that any non-trivial program that consists of many lines of code starts to get really unwieldy and is really hard to change and maintain. And functions really make that process a lot easier. Now, the reason why I included the word methods is because C# is an object-oriented language, and in object-oriented parlance, functions are typically called methods. Because in C#, a function has to be part of an object. There are no global functions, which I covered a little bit earlier. So the word function and method are pretty much interchangeable in this context. So anywhere you see me use the word functions, you can just mentally hear me using the word methods and or vice versa. To define a function, it's a pretty straightforward process. We start off by giving it a name. So to create a function, the function has to have a name, and you can use whatever uppercase, lowercase rules you want to use. In this case, I'm starting off with a lowercase letter, and I'm using what's called camel case. I'm capitalizing the interior words of the function, but that's up to you. You can use letters. You can't use special symbols like $signs or parentheses or anything like that. It's got to be alphanumeric. So here I have a function, and I've given it a name. Then I have to give it what's called a parameter list. There are two parentheses, and inside those parentheses, these are the arguments that the function takes. This is the data that the function is going to operate on. And inside the function, I have the code of the function. This is the stuff that the function does. In this case, the function is simply calling console.writeLine. In the parameter list, where the arguments go, I can supply one or more arguments or parameters to the function. So for example, if I wanted to pass in an integer, I would pass in int x. In some other languages like JavaScript, you don't have to declare the type in front of the argument. You simply give the argument a name and you pass it into the function. And C# doesn't work like that. In C#, you have to tell the function, here's the kind of argument that's going to be coming in. In this case, it's an integer. If I wanted to pass in more than one, I would use a comma to separate them. And in this case, I'm passing in an integer named x and a date argument named d. Now, in addition to the name of the function and the arguments, I have to say what the return type of the function is. What kind of value does the function pass back? I can say, for example, that the function passes back an integer. Now, notice I don't name what the function is passing back. I'm just simply saying here that the function returns an integer. And it can return an integer, it can return a string, it can return any other kind of data type. And we'll learn a little bit more about data types later on in the course. But for now, just follow along with me here. I'm saying that this function returns an integer, and it takes an integer and a date as an argument. If I didn't want to pass in any arguments, I can simply leave the area inside the parentheses blank and not pass in any arguments at all. But in this case, I've got a couple of arguments. And then finally, there's the code inside the curly braces for the function, and that's what the function actually does. In cases where functions return a value, in this case, this function is returning an integer, I have to make sure that the function actually does that. And I do that by using the return statement. In this case, I am returning a variable named SomeValue, which is probably defined somewhere in this function as an integer. Value that I'm returning has to match the type of the return value for the function. So if I declared this SomeValue variable in my function somewhere, it would have to be an integer, just like the return type of the function. Functions don't have to return values. I could just simply say void, in which case I've defined a function that takes a couple of arguments but doesn't return anything. And in that case, I don't need a return statement at all. I can just simply get rid of that because there is no return value for the function. I could also just simply use the word return with a semicolon by itself, but in this case, I've just gotten rid of it because it doesn't return anything. So let's actually jump over to the code and see how to write a function that does what we've described here. So in my funcs and methods project, I've also got my snippets file open, and I've scrolled down to the functions and methods part. So let's go ahead and copy some of this code and paste it in. I'm going to copy these 3 lines. I'll paste that. Let's take a look at what I've pasted in. I've got an integer variable named result1, and then I'm assigning result1 the result of a formula function. And you can see here that there's some red squiggles there. It says the name formula does not exist in the current context. That's a function that apparently takes an integer argument, which I have not defined yet. So let me go get the code for the formula function. And that's it right here. I'm going to copy that, and I'm going to paste it. So now I've defined a function named formula, which takes an integer argument and returns an integer. For the moment, you've probably noticed this word static right here. Just bear with me about why we need that. I'm not going to cover it right now. We'll get to that when we get to the section on object-oriented programming a little bit later. It's just something we need right now for the function to work. So don't worry about that right now. Just pretend it's not there. What's important is the return type right here of int, and the argument it takes is an int. And this is the name of the function right here. In some languages, for example, C or Objective-C, the order in which you define your functions is somewhat important. So for example, if this were C and I put the definition of this function down below where I'm calling it up here, I would have to have some type of code statement up here that says, hey, program, there's going to be this function called formula that you're going to come across. Don't worry about it. I'm just telling you about it now. In C#, you don't need to do that. In C#, you can just declare this function wherever you like, and you can call it from over here. And the C# interpreter is smart enough to realize, oh, okay, well, there must be a function named formula coming down, so I'll just wait till I see it. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to call the formula function with an argument. In this case, it's 14. The function is going to do its work. It's going to return an integer value, and that value is going to be set into result1. And then this statement right here, console.writeLine, is going to write out whatever the result is. So let's go ahead and save that, and let's run it. And you can see that the result being written out is 24. So the result of the formula inside the function evaluated to be 24. So let's hit OK. Let's go back up here. Let's change this to something else. I'm going to type a new variable. I'm going to call it arg1. And I'm going to give it a value of 25. And now, instead of passing in the hard-coded value of 14, I'm going to copy arg1, and I'm going to paste it in the calling place where I'm calling formula. I'm going to save it, going to run it, and you can see that now we've produced a different result. So that pretty much brings us to the close of this section. In this section, we've seen how program flow works. We've covered things like functions, and we've seen constants and enumerations. We've learned how to write conditional statements, and we've learned about operators and expressions. We've got to the point now where we continue on and learn more about C# and learn how to do things like declare variables and use objects and so on. But this chapter should have given you a good foundation for a lot of the basic parts of C# that you're going to come across in any program that you decide to write or work on.